I saw a cannonball, nearly spent in its flight, approaching. It seemed as though it was looking for me and drawn towards me as if by a magnet. I flattened as close to the ground as possible and awaited my fate. It slipped over me and killed Benning Wentworth, who was lying at my feet. Lieutenant Field, in command of that company, moved and brushed some dust from his clothing. I asked if he was injured. He said he was not, but that Wentworth was dead. That was easily perceived. His exit was painless, unless he had seen the ball coming and suffered in anticipation. The patient endurance of effective artillery fire while remaining passive is the supreme test of the fortitude of soldiers. Hi, my name is Bill Coughlin, and host the First Person Civil War podcast. While the generals of both sides get most of the recognition, the Civil War was fought by the men in the ranks, and they told their stories during and after the war. Follow me as I reveal what these men witnessed in the battles of the Civil War. Episode 54 is entitled Sergeant Edwin C. Bennett and the 22nd Massachusetts at the Battle of Malvern Hill, and relies on his book, Musket and Sword, or The Camp, March, and Firing Line in the Army of the Potomac, which he published in 1900. Edwin Clark Bennett was born on 3 February 1840 in Somerville, Massachusetts, as one of 12 children. Edwin's family had deep ties with New England, as his great-grandfather served in the Continental Army and present at the Siege of Boston. In the summer of 1860, Edwin joined the Massachusetts militia as a private in the local company, the Somerville Light Infantry. At the outbreak of the Civil War, it reflagged as Company I, 5th Massachusetts, a 90-day militia regiment. Clad in their gray militia uniforms, Private Bennett and the 5th Massachusetts shipped to Washington, D.C., and eventually fought at the First Battle of Bull Run. With their 90 days of service expired, Private Bennett and the 5th Massachusetts returned home. But for Edwin, his service in the Army was only just beginning. Patriotism had now become a passion with the young men of the North. Those who had served 3 months were mastered by it. Nearly all found that they could not be content at home, while the fate of the country was at stake upon the field of battle. On 16 September 1861, Edwin Bennett enlisted as a sergeant in Company G of the 22nd Massachusetts. Though a newly formed company, many of the men came from the various 90-day militia regiments which had by this time returned home. The first colonel of the 22nd Massachusetts was its benefactor, a United States Senator named Henry Wilson, who held the honor for about 2 months. Fully equipped by him, the regiment mustered into service in late September, and on 8 October received their regimental colors in the Boston Common. A beautiful flag was given us, Honorable Robert C. Winthrop speaking for the donors. His address was able and eloquent, and has survived the war. It is regarded as a classic in cultured circles. We had also a state flag, but never took it into action. One flag or color was enough to guard under fire. We were fighting for the national principle and as Union soldiers, and were proud of our state. The supremacy of Old Glory was the object of our efforts, and its presence inspired us as no other emblem could. Sergeant Bennett and the 22nd Massachusetts arrived in Washington, D.C. on 11 October and went into winter quarters at Falls Church, Virginia. The Army of the Potomac was by this time beginning to take shape. and the 22nd Massachusetts formed a brigade alongside the 2nd Maine, 18th Massachusetts, the 13th, and 25th New York regiments, under the command of Brigadier General John H. Martindale, which was assigned to the 3rd Corps. In March of 1862, after months of buildup around Washington, the Army of the Potomac began its movement by water to the Virginia Peninsula. Major General McClellan, the Army's commander, desired a quick march on the Confederate capital at Richmond, and he believed marching up the peninsula was a better avenue of approach compared to advancing south from Washington, D.C. By mid-March, the Army of the Potomac began its advance up the peninsula. In early April, the 22nd Massachusetts as a regiment saw its first action at the Siege of Yorktown. As the campaign continued up the peninsula, Major General McClellan reorganized his army, which resulted in the creation of 2 new corps, the 5th and 6th. Incorporating reinforcements sent from Washington, D.C., the Army of the Potomac now had 5 corps in total, the 2nd through 6th. Sergeant Bennett and the 22nd Massachusetts witnessed the reorganization firsthand, as their entire division shifted commands, and now marched in Brigadier General John H. Martindale's 1st Brigade, in Brigadier General George W. Morrell's 1st Division, of Brigadier General Fitz J. Porter's 5th Corps. By late May, the Union Army had successfully marched to less than 10 miles from Richmond. After retreating up the peninsula, General Joseph E. Johnston, commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, attacked 2 Union corps at the Battle of Seven Pines. The battle proved inconclusive, but one of the lasting outcomes of Seven Pines was the wounding of General Johnston on the evening of 31 May. With a bullet in his right shoulder and shell fragments in his chest, Johnston was unable to retain command of the Army of Northern Virginia. The next day, 1 June 1862, General Robert E. Lee took command of the army. For most of June, General Lee reorganized the Army of Northern Virginia and strengthened defenses around Richmond, while Major General McClellan remained idle outside the capital. Reinforcements from the Shenandoah, which was Major General Stonewall Jackson's division, arrived, and thanks to reconnaissance provided by Brigadier General Jeb Stuart's cavalry, Lee now knew the disposition of the Army of the Potomac and planned an offensive to push it away from Richmond. On 25 June, Major General McClellan sent the 3rd Corps forward to bring his siege artillery into range of Richmond and met a Confederate division at the Battle of Oak Grove, which proved inconclusive, but also marked the start of what is known today as the 7 Days Battles. On 26 June, Lee began his offensive and struck the 5th Corps at Mechanicsville, also known as the Battle of Beaver Dam Creek, where Sergeant Bennett and the 22nd Massachusetts marched to the support of the Pennsylvania reserves on the Corps' right flank. The next day, at the Battle of Gaines's Mill, Sergeant Bennett and the 22nd Massachusetts suffered its greatest loss of the war in number of casualties. After holding the reserve line, the regiment moved to the front. The rebels were within 50 feet of us in the direction that we were aiming when Noel was struck in the face. The concussion sounded like a blow given by an open hand. I turned to the left, saying that Noel was killed, and saw that the line was broken beyond our regiment. The enemy were flanking us and getting into our rear. I ran the gauntlet with the fleetness of a deer, shunning the crowd that followed a natural depression or roadway. The 22nd Massachusetts and other regiments managed to rally with the reserve artillery, but paid a heavy price at Gaines's Mill. Of approximately 650 men in the regiment, 71 were killed, including the regimental commander, 31 wounded, and 76 captured, a casualty rate of 27%. Sergeant Bennett and the 22nd Massachusetts were absent from the fighting for the next 3 days. During that time, the Army of Northern Virginia continued to push the Army of the Potomac further away from Richmond. On 30 June, as the battles of Glendale and White Oak Swamp unfolded, the entire 5th Corps occupied Malvern Hill. 1.5 miles long at the crest and 3/4 of a mile in width, it had a gentle slope of 1 mile in length to an elevation of 130 feet. With the entire Army of the Potomac retreating toward Malvern Hill, the 5th Corps was reinforced by elements from several corps and artillery from across the Army that numbered approximately 208 pieces and placed along the slope and the crest. On 1 July 1862, after 6 days of fighting and still looking to smash the Union Army, Lee once again attacked, this time at Malvern Hill. Placed in reserve at the center of the line was Sergeant Bennett and the 22nd Massachusetts. Early in the afternoon, he moved forward for a short space and formed in a column of 5 companies at half-wheeling distance. We lay down, covering a very small area. Our position was 50 feet in advance of a large tree. There was a slight ascent in the field in our front for 300 yards. Then, as we afterwards discerned, the descent to a great field was rapid. It was skirted by woods, in which the rebel infantry was disposed. Artillery was placed at the foot of the hill, where its shots in their whole flight would not be over 5 feet from the earth. The Confederates amassed artillery on the flanks of their line and attempted to concentrate their fire. If successful, the artillery barrage would give way to an infantry assault that would exploit the weakened Union line. Lying down under the Confederate fire was Sergeant Bennett and the 22nd Massachusetts. The enemy had a battery with which they were endeavoring to reach us, and must have had the tree for a landmark. The situation was made very trying for us. We lost 50 men from our small battalion during the day. 1/2 of them were injured while we were under this ordeal. Where one ball or fragment of a shell would find a victim, 20 of the diabolical things would barely miss some of his comrades. Shell wounds are ghastly, cruel to the injured, and demoralizing to beholders, especially to those who are in the line of promotion to another world. The artillery barrage persisted for about 1 hour. During this time, Union artillerists successfully silenced several batteries across the battlefield. As this artillery duel unfolded, Sergeant Bennett had a brush with death. I saw a cannonball, nearly spent in its flight, approaching. It seemed as though it was looking for me and drawn towards me as if by a magnet. I flattened as close to the ground as possible and awaited my fate. It slipped over me and killed Benning Wentworth, who was lying at my feet. Lieutenant Field, in command of that company, moved and brushed some dust from his clothing. I asked if he was injured. He said he was not, but that Wentworth was dead. That was easily perceived. His exit was painless, unless he had seen the ball coming and suffered in anticipation. The patient endurance of effective artillery fire while remaining passive is the supreme test of the fortitude of soldiers. Following the artillery barrage, the Confederates began their assaults upon the Union line. With Sergeant Bennett and the 22nd Massachusetts held in their reserve position, Brigadier General Charles Griffin's 2nd Brigade held the center and repelled several Confederate advances. After this, a sharp fire was kept up by skirmishers and artillery until 5:30, when the enemy made his final and fiercest attack on our left. The artillery continued its effective fire until the enemy arrived within a few yards of our batteries, when the supporting regiments, 4th Michigan, 9th Massachusetts, 62nd Pennsylvania, gallantly moved forward and repulsed him. But a fresh force making its appearance both on the left and right, the regiments were compelled to fall back. 5 times were the colors of the 62nd cut down, and as often determinately raised and rescued, the last time being picked up by an officer of the 44th New York. The 62nd Pennsylvania left the field with its colors flying. With regiments from the division's 3rd Brigade already reinforcing his line, Brigadier General Griffin needed another regiment to take the 62nd Pennsylvania's position in line. It was Sergeant Bennett and the 22nd Massachusetts that took its place. The 62nd Pennsylvania, having practically exhausted its ammunition, faced to the left and filed to the rear. We moved forward and took their place, and dressed our line and commenced firing, using 60 rounds each at least. One of the Confederates to make the charge upon the Union center was Brigadier General Samuel Garland, who commanded the 3rd Brigade of Major General D.H. Hill's division, and testified to the ferocity of the artillery and musketry the Union center brought down upon them. The brigade moved forward with alacrity, about halfway to the battery or nearer. When the terrible fire of the artillery and the opening fire of the infantry induced it to halt, lie down, and commence firing without my orders, and contrary to them. After some delay, a brigade appeared from the woods in my rear, and seemed coming up to my support. But their movements seemed slow, and before they reached me, my men began to give way, and very many ceased to respond to my efforts to hold them in line and maintain the position, remaining on the spot until, in spite of every effort, the men could no longer be held there. The brigade fell back to the edge of the woods, from which we had started. Throughout the afternoon, the Confederates sent assault columns up Malvern Hill, but none were successful. The massed Union artillery, with plenty of infantry support, like Sergeant Bennett and the 22nd Massachusetts, held the line until nightfall. The Confederates were repulsed at every point. The force of their onslaught was declining when we relieved the 62nd Pennsylvania. We expended all our ammunition, and the ordnance train was on the way to the rear, but the enemy brought forward no reserves. We gathered wheat straw from our front and endeavored to sleep. The groans of the wounded arose like a chorus. Occasionally, a howitzer would be discharged, and the flash would penetrate the gloom almost to the woods. Men from the ambulance corps, aided by volunteers, were searching by the light of lanterns for wounded friends and comrades. But the great mass of the unfortunate were not relieved that night. Despite such a success at Malvern Hill, Major General McClellan continued the retreat of his army toward Harrison's Landing, where it enjoyed the protection of Union gunboats. Malvern Hill marked the end of the 7 days' battles, which produced heavy casualties on both sides. General Lee had successfully pushed the Union Army back, and McClellan, believing to be woefully outnumbered, ordered a retreat down the peninsula and eventually withdrew back to Washington, D.C. Sergeant Bennett and the 22nd Massachusetts were present at Antietam, but the entire 5th Corps remained in reserve the entire day. By the Battle of Fredericksburg, Edwin Bennett was a first lieutenant, and wounded in the jaw and neck. The 22nd Massachusetts saw further service at Gettysburg, the Overland Campaign, and Petersburg, and mustered out of service on 17 October 1864. And Edwin Bennett ended the war as a brevet lieutenant colonel. In 1900, Edwin Bennett published Musket and Sword, or the Camp, March, and Firing Line in the Army of the Potomac. In the preface, Edwin explained why he wrote the book, which is the same reason why I host this podcast. The literature of the Civil War has been voluminous in its descriptions of campaigns and of the service of our great commanders. It has, however, been deficient in graphic portrayal of the characteristics of the enlisted men and their immediate leaders. The details of practical warfare constituting the everyday life of officers and soldiers are worthy of full presentation and careful study. I have endeavored to faithfully depict types of the representative elements of our devoted Army, and to record the opinions current at the front during the different stages of our prolonged contest. Thank you for listening to the 54th episode. The link to Sergeant Bennett's book is now available on the podcast website, firstpersoncivilwarpodcast.com. On Facebook, Instagram, X, and LinkedIn this week, you will find a picture of Edwin Bennett in 1863 and 1900. Please like, follow, and subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you use, as it helps to grow the audience. And in 2 weeks' time, Private William A. McClendon of Company G, 15th Alabama, provides next episode's first-person account at the Battle of Cross Keys. My name is Bill Coughlin, and thank you for listening to First Person Civil War Podcast.